Mahalo to invited speaker Mark Toney. Please welcome the State of Hawaii's Chief Energy Officer Scott Glenn and Community Leader Sunny Unga as they discuss Hawaii's inclusive energy transition.
Aloha, everyone. Mark, thank you for your strong message. I want to second what Doug said. I think a lot of folks were nodding along, certainly here in the Energy Office. And I want to thank everyone today for joining us and making time to spend a little bit with Sunny Unga and me. Before we get started, I'd like to just do a little bit of context setting. In mid-October 2019, two events happened. The less important one was that I started my first day as the Chief Energy Officer for the state of Hawaii. The more important one, and the very next day, 55 people were arrested, blocking the movement of wind turbines. And over that week, more than 200 arrests would occur. And listening to the speakers on Tuesday and all the different energy policy conversations we're in, my sense is more and more that it's less about technology. And the challenge is really, how do we work with ourselves? How do we make room to grow, to learn lessons, and to do better? To better understand what we can do going forward, I went up to Kahuku to see the turbines myself. I reached out to the residents of the Kahuku community to teach me, and I reached out to the developer to learn from them. I did this under Hawaii Revised Statutes, Section 5-7.5, Paragraph B. And if you're not familiar with that, it's the Aloha Spirit Law, and I recommend taking a look at it. Through this effort, I got to know Sunny Unga. Sunny taught me right away one thing when she made a comment, and it was in passing, that our energy policy work doesn't even include community. And I was struck. I replied, well, we work with all stakeholders. And she responded that stakeholders are entities like HECO and Blue Planet, but not the communities and the people who live next to the utility scale projects. And that difference in how we saw the world really opened my eyes and stuck with me. Over the past year and a half, conversations such as this that I've had with Sunny and others have helped shape how the Energy Office will be pursuing its work going forward. And I invited Sunny to be a part of this conference to hear what people's ideas are and recommendations, and for folks today to hopefully hear her message. And for this session, Sunny and I, we're just here to have a conversation. We want to exchange some questions with each other and with you all. And that doesn't mean that we agree with each other's perspective. But I believe it's important that we listen and that we keep the lines of communication open. As the Energy Office, our job is to work with everyone in the state of Hawaii, stakeholders and communities. I believe that people can disagree without being disagreeable. And I hope you're able to hear Sunny and recognize that even if you don't agree with her views, that she is voicing what many people do feel. And I don't mean to put anyone on the spot today, for sure. But I think we should all be aware that we're all on the spot. The world is watching how Hawaii handles its renewable energy transition. We're all in this canoe together, and we're balancing on the width of a blade of a pili grass. And so with that, Sunny, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your kind introduction. I do appreciate you inviting me to this panel to discuss a very important issue. And I do believe that the time to start having these difficult conversations is now, and that we need to reflect on what happened in Kahuku and what led to the mass arrest of the community, and really be willing to make an honest assessment on what failed our Kahuku community. And that is by listening to our experiences. And I think that the only way we can learn and make the necessary changes in this current process and to be more inclusive and transparent with the community is starting with the community.
Thank you, Sunny. And I really appreciate you making time. And I know it was a little difficult for you too, having to rearrange life schedule to make time to be here. So ahead of this, Sunny and I exchanged some questions with each other that we thought would be useful to discuss. So we'd like to ask those. And while we're talking, we'll keep an eye on the questions that come in. So Sunny, maybe I'll start with the first question. When we first met, you were already active on a particular renewable energy project. And one of the things that I admired about you is that you continuously try to learn. You try to understand more about why and how things happen the way they do. And can you share some of the things that you've learned about energy, land use, being a community advocate maybe a little bit about your journey and coming to this understanding you have today?
Yes, of course. Well, my experience as a community advocate has been one with lots of learning and growth, especially topics related to energy. I really didn't know what I was getting into when I initially got involved advocating for a Kuku community, in particularly opposing the NPM Napomakani project. But it led me down to different paths, and that's how I got to meet you, Scott. And community advocacy work has definitely been a learning, growing process for me. And I do recognize that I still have a lot to learn. But I did find it very challenging to know how to navigate all the different procedures, the policies, and the processes in various government agencies, whether it be through commissions and boards and council meetings as a community member. And for me, I learned one step at a time, one meeting at a time, attending various meetings such as the BLNR meetings, council hearings, PUC hearings, the legislative session, and so forth. And I was really fortunate to have people around me that mentored and taught and guided me throughout all of this process. And at the same time, it did take a lot of time and commitment and effort on my part as well. And what I want to share is that throughout this process, one thing that became very apparent to me was how hard it is for community members to figure all of this out and to navigate all these different processes. And in addition to those challenges, when we finally, when community members finally figure out how to get involved and how to show up and testify on issues, we were more often, well, I personally felt was left feeling like our voices really didn't matter or have any influence on the decisions. And I think this is a pressing issue that really needs to be addressed and changed. We really do need to have our decision makers reflect our community voices. And I do feel that that is currently lacking in our current processes.
Well, I think you've been pretty clear that you think we should be being more holistic and systems-wide thinking in how we approach these things. And something was really that I thought would be valuable in you being a part of this is that you would also get to attend the conference and hear what other folks were saying, get to hear folks like Mark or Tuesday's presenters. And I'm just wondering, as someone kind of coming into this really kind of expert-oriented conference, what are some of the takeaways for you? Anything you learned or anything that really resonated with you from what you've heard so far?
Well, initially when I received the invitation from you, and to be frank, I really wouldn't be here if it weren't for your invitation. So I am grateful for this opportunity that I have to share the community's perspective based on my experiences, at least through this panel discussion with you, Scott. But I wanted to point out that, the current event, the way in which it's organized currently, it really makes it difficult for the community members to participate, and starting with the high registration costs. And I hope that things can change for next year to make it more available for grassroots community members to attend, because that is the way the community can start learning about these issues and give voice to, the issues that are related to, what's impacting their community and Hawaii as a whole. And as I was preparing this panel discussion, I kind of went to the website to learn about what this conference was about. And then the first thing that I did notice was the talks on, how transitioning into this renewable energy or 100% renewable energy will require the community and the indigenous groups, and how it needs to build trust and respect between the stakeholders and the community, and have this equitable development in order for it to be successful. So I was interested to see what kind of topics would be discussed and how they would address, issues like equity and community and indigenous perspectives and things like that. And at the same time, I couldn't help but feel that, these meaningful discussions on equity environmental justice or indigenous perspective or inclusiveness to the community would be extremely difficult when our grassroots community members or our organizations cannot be present here to share our perspective or our experiences. And you know, to some degree, I did feel a little bit out of place and uncomfortable because I felt like I was surrounded by all industry people or developers or people who are very involved in the energy field in those areas. But I did appreciate the topics on Tuesday because there was discussion on cultural studies and community involvement and engaging the community and, you know, listening to their voices. But I think that, you know, it's important not just to have these philosophical discussions. I think it's very important that we really understand and get to know the real experiences for the community. You know, like, for example, like, are these cultural studies or community engagement or community voices, are they actually happening on a meaningful level in these processes when these projects are being developed or proposed or going through the permitting process? And, you know, and unfortunately, I do feel like what happened to the Kahuku community kind of, you know, shows that it's not really happening in a meaningful way, you know, adequately addressing those, you know, principles of equity or community involvement or community consent. And, you know, it's more like a formality or checkbox, I do feel like. And so the question is like, how do we become more inclusive in our energy transition? And I do believe that it starts by, you know, giving the community a seat at the table as partners, you know, and including our voices in these stakeholder meetings and conferences and really, really start to listen. And hopefully, you know, the next conference, we can find ways to bring in these grassroots community organizations and members and to actually have, you know, participation from these groups.
Thank you. I think it's a valuable recommendation. You know, maybe I see some questions in here getting to that, but maybe we could pause my questions, Sunny, and if you want to maybe ask some of the questions you had prepared for me, and I can do my best to try to answer some of them.
Yeah, so, you know, we have this very important mandate, which is, you know, to get to 100% renewable energy goal, you know, and as we're recognizing more and more, like, we really need to have the community support in order to successfully achieve this goal. And so I kind of wanted to maybe pick your brain and your thoughts on how you view community consent and consultation, and what plans does your office have in ensuring that these communities are active participants and that they're meaningfully engaged and deciding on these developments of energy projects, particularly, you know, those that are coming into the communities.
Yeah, I think that's a question a lot of us are really, you know, grappling with, and I think you make an interesting distinction. And could I ask you a little bit to expand on what you see the difference of consent versus consultation being? Just kind of curious for folks to hear your thought on how you see those things being different.
Yeah, I think the community consultation is, you know, when projects are already decided, right, ahead of time, and then they go into the community and say, okay, let's consult the community. What are your thoughts? What can we do to change things? But I think the challenge in that is that the projects are already decided at that point without really getting the community's support or, you know, opposition, or, you know what I mean? Like, the developer can come in and say, hey, this is what I want to do, and they go ahead and get all the permits, they get the, you know, the leases and everything, and then it's kind of like a done deal. So after that, if they come and say, hey, community, we're going to do wind development, you know, especially in Kahuku, in our particular, you know, situation, it's just like, well, we don't want wind anymore. We already have 12. We want something else. Or we think that, you know, more wind turbines should be, you know, elsewhere with a different community, but that community consultation process just does not allow for the community to have some sort of say as to what comes into the community. It happens after the fact. And so then it becomes really challenging to put the community's interest and their voice when it's challenged with what the developers want and what utility scale development is requiring to have. And so I think that community consent is really important because we're asking the community even before we get all these permits and plans. Like, we're asking, what do you want? So it's community led and it's community empowered, and the community has some sort of say. And I think that really shifts and changes how we approach and how we do things, if that makes sense.
I think it does. And I don't see consultation quite the same way, though. To me, consultation is something that can occur at any time. I used to be the director of the Office of Environmental Quality Control, and in the rules for the environmental review process, right, it says consult as early as possible or as early as practicable, right? And I know that's something that a lot of folks struggle with. Is there's this kind of tension between going and talking with folks too early when there's not enough information to answer questions, and then going too late when too many things have already been decided and are kind of locked in. And that's certainly something I think government tries to balance. And I think, a lot of developers try to balance that as well. I think one of the things that we also are trying to figure out as the Energy Office is scale, right? Every community has some role in our renewable energy future. And what is that role? And how do we work with folks across all of the islands to try to help them understand their role and the opportunities that they have, and to voice the things that they don't want. And so that's something that we will actually be doing as part of our effort. Is I think what we heard from a lot of folks, communities, yourself, and in industry as well, is that one of the roles of the Energy Office is to be that neutral third party. We're an advocate for our renewable energy goals, but not necessarily any one project. That we're not necessarily here to champion someone, but to be that kind of neutral, ideally trusted voice that can be a part of a conversation and help folks be a bridge and understand each other so that we can move forward. And we'll be doing a lot more of that work going forward. Hopefully, again, I know this is a lot of hope I'm saying, but these are the pieces we're putting in place now through contracting, use of some of our federal fund grants, and things to do things like even kind of basic building block things like overhaul our website to make it really easy for people to use. It's our website right now. I often joke you need a PhD in library science to find what you're looking for in it. And I can't even find stuff I'm looking for half the time. But we're already starting to take steps to improve that. We have some vistas in the office that they're a great team. And one of the things that they did, and their focus is energy equity, is to start putting together resources for families who need financial assistance with their energy bills. And so now that's something we never really put up before, but we put it together, and it's now a resource people can use. Similarly, with our, these utility scale projects, there's a lot of solar and solar plus battery storage projects going on, and a lot of community meetings happening, or neighborhood board hearings, or public hearings around these projects. And we've been trying to put on our website in one place where someone could go and see these are the community meetings that are coming up related to these projects. And so, we're trying to be really that fact-based third-party source of information that people can agree on and say, we can use this to inform our decision making. And we also want to just do a lot of education, that kind of energy 101, right? You asked me a really important question when we first met, which is, we already have wind turbines, we're getting more wind turbines, but we don't even have solar on our roof. Why can't we have solar? Why don't we have solar? What's the state doing to help us get solar? And I think that's an important question. And I think it's something that we're certainly working on. And there's a lot of grid challenges to the level of solar that we're trying to put on and add more over time. But I think that's a fair question to ask is, people want solar on their roofs. How can we help them get it, especially communities that live with utility scale energy projects?
Right, right. And and I speak from, my experience as a Kuku resident. We're a small rural town of, less than 540 households. We're literally surrounded by 20 turbines. And, that brings a big concern and about, how these renewable energy projects, how we distribute, these burdens, across all the different communities. That we're bearing 40% of Oahu's wind as of right now. And how do we ensure that these utility scale renewable energy projects are distributed across all communities and not just overburdening the same communities such as Kuhuku or Waianae, those communities that are, that have struggles, right? So I think that's what, we need to really, think about.
Yeah,
The
it's a good
environmental
question.
part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the, I think, things that we have to be cognizant of, right, is when we talk about renewable energy, especially things that are kind of true renewables, wind, solar, geothermal, they're very location based, right? We can't just decide to put something somewhere because that's the most convenient place to put it, right? We really have to go to where the resource is. And if we don't put it there and we put it somewhere else where the resource isn't, then we have to put in more turbines to get the same amount of power, or we have to put in more panels to get the same amount of power, versus where it's kind of the best suited land for that. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, and those are difficult conversations to be had because, just because the resources are there in a particular community, do we put all the turbines in one community, or do we, does that make sense? Like, there are other places that have wind resources, right? And it may not be as, resourceful as certain areas, but there needs to be some sort of equity and environmental justice in this conversation. We can't just continue to overburden, the same communities just because there are resources there. And, how are we going to address, the elephant in the room? There are certain communities that are more affluent, and are those communities stepping up and bearing their burden to really help us move forward in this energy transition, right?
Yeah, and that's a powerful question, and I don't have an answer now, and it's something we'll be dialoguing with everyone on over the ensuing months. Maybe we could pause there and turn to some of the questions. In here, I see the top question looks like one that's really maybe a question for you, Sunny. And just so you know, this is coming from someone who works at the PUC, so your message is getting directly to them. They're asking, when reaching out to community, how should a regulator, developer, company determine who speaks for the community? There's lots of different voices, lots of different interests in a community, and how does government or a company or a landowner feel like they've heard the voices and the concerns across the community? And maybe some thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that's a process that we still need to figure out, right? How do we engage the community? Who do we talk to? And how do we adequately ensure that those voices are being heard? And I'm speaking from my Kuhuku experience. The community liaison was not from Kuhuku, right? It was from a neighboring person, and that just so that's just one specific example. We can't be having community liaisons that are not from the host community, and of course there's going to be division, right? But are we listening to the majority of the community concerns and the voices? And I think we just need to take a step back and look at the current process. The current process is very top-down approach. very developer utility driven. And that in and of itself makes it extremely hard for the community to have voice. The current process, for example, in Kahuku, one of our community members wanted to intervene in the PUC docket as an interested party because they felt like, I'm a community member, I'm a resident, this is going to directly impact me. I want to intervene, but that was denied. So we see these processes and procedures, even when the community wants to be a voice and wants to participate, and there's that challenge of education, right? How does the community go about doing it? How do we know where these permits and where these applications are being made? We didn't, like, the community is supposed to know that a particular developer, applied for variance to place these turbines even closer than the setback regulation, right? It's just extremely hard. So I think we really need to take a look at the current process and how things are done. And it's just makes it really challenging for our community voices to actually have meaning, right, to make a difference. And we can say too big, too close, right? And even before my time, not behind my keiki school, no more turbines. And this is a decade-long fight. And yet we end up with the project so intrusive and so close to the community. So we really got to think about, okay, what went wrong? What are the current procedures and processes that really, ignore, like, make it so that it, the community voices can kind of get drowned out, right? Like, if it comes to between, like, what the community wants versus what the developer wants, at the end, with this current process, in my experience, what the developer wants trumps over what the community wants or what the communities are voicing. So yeah. I hope that answers the question.
And I certainly know that that's your experience. I don't think that's a universal experience. And there are cases of communities and developers and landowners working very collaboratively together on projects. And also, I don't use that verb anymore. I've expunged that word Trump from my vocabulary. There's another question here that I think might build on what you were just saying. So let's assume folks are engaging with you guys, your voices are being heard. What are some of the messages? Is there room for compromise? Is there ways to craft? We often refer to them as community benefits agreements, which can take different shapes, but don't necessarily have to be that particular thing. What are some of the ways that we can work together? And I'll just say, for me, I think an ideal outcome is we have a project that a community feels proud to be the host of. That's where I feel like we're really successful. But maybe you could share some thoughts on what are those exchanges, compromises, space for learning and changing minds?
Well, I think in order for the community to feel proud of of a particular project coming into the community and to have the community support, like, we really need to rebuild the system from the people up, and coming up with ways in which how we combat climate change, or and come up with different projects that are needed. I think that these goals need to have, need to encompass, like, food sustainability, indigenous rights, and other ecological protections as a whole. I don't think that it could be just narrowly focused, because if we just narrowly focused on, we need all these renewable energy, regardless of what community wants, regardless of, our other important goals such as agriculture and food security, like, we're going to end up with bad projects. And I want to, reiterate that this top-down, profit-driven approach, they really do put corporate interests and profits over the well-being and interests of the community and their voice. And we really need to ensure that communities are active participants and meaningfully engaged in the development of clean energy projects that are community and culturally driven. And, just by example, like, this conference, where are the grassroots community members and organizations? Like, are we really reaching out to them and really hearing their stories? Okay, what happened? What went wrong? How did we fail the Kahuku community? How did this project come out to be the way it is right now. And of course, this is a process that we need to change and we need to figure out. But in order to figure out how to make these systemic changes or procedural changes, we need to have these communities here, and we need to be listening to them, and we need to find out what the challenges are, what actually does happen in the community consultation process or the cultural studies, or these community meetings with the developers, and what do we need to change those. And without the community's voice here and figuring out these issues and problems, we won't be able to find ways to improve and make those necessary changes that will make a difference, a positive impact.
Well, maybe if I could, one of the questions in here is kind of this question of checking in with the community, engaging with folks. You mentioned at the beginning how much of a learning process it was. And, often government is very complicated and has all these little nuances and steps, and there's reasons often for them. It's because something went wrong and we had to put that rule in place so that everybody knows what the rule is going forward. And it adds up to a lot of, process. And, there's only so many hours of the day. You yourself have mentioned, how hard it is to make time to attend these things, and the enormous effort you've done with rearranging your family schedule to attend a hearing, or today even, you'd mentioned, I got to find a babysitter to be able to participate. And, on the developer side or the government side, how much and how often, because we also want to be cognizant that we don't want to keep pinging people constantly to say, hey, because, things got to get decided. Things do have to, things have to happen. And, where are some of those kind of key checkpoints, or, are there some steps there that you guys feel that you might feel, this is enough, or this is too much, or, because we have to do this all day, right? This is our day job, is to check in on all these different projects, all these different communities. And, but we also want to be cognizant of putting too much on folks to constantly be weighing in on things and having to interrupt their day and their daily life to get involved on something. So any thoughts on that?
Well, I think based on my experience with, my involvement with the Napumakani and community advocacy work, I do feel like the current system is broken. And I think that this is not just related to the energy sector, right? Like, we see all these things happening all across in different, different things that we see on the news, right? Like, I do feel like the community voice is not being heard, and I feel like it's not being reflected in the decision making. Our leaders and our policymakers and decision makers, we could have over 700 comments on a PUC docket, right? Which was more than, I think that was the most that any PUC docket had received any comments on, right? And still, we end up feeling like it doesn't really matter how much effort we put in, right? And there's ongoing things going on other issues, despite community voice and community opposition. Like, we continue to feel like we're not being heard. And I think that's the overall issue that we really need to address. Yes, there are challenges for community members to be involved. Like, there's issues with, knowing how to go about getting involved and knowing how to navigate all these different procedural things, how to testify, what do you know what I mean? But aside from that, I really think that we really our agencies or developers really need to improve on how they engage the community. We could have a community meeting, but what good does this community meeting do when at the end of the day, the developer is going to do what they want? And it's like, yeah.
So maybe a couple thoughts are, try to schedule a couple of different meetings at different times, because you're not going to get everyone at one time. And maybe also try to do more one-on-ones and kind of maybe small coffee hour type talks that can get groups of people together. I think one thing we hear from folks is that at public meetings, people don't necessarily feel comfortable to get up and speak and say what their real thought is. And, people get embarrassed, or they're shy, or they're afraid they'll get criticized if they say what they really think. And so a lot of times what we try to do too is have these kind of smaller discussions. And but that also means everyone else isn't hearing what that person's thought is, just us. So that's also, I think, a bit of a challenge for us to navigate. And I think you've touched on a deeper question, which is, it's not just energy, right? We have this kind of broad-based concern about government and how representative is government of its citizens. And so, it shows up not just in energy, but in food and other land use questions and other uses of resources for the collective good. And that's certainly a challenge I think we all are working through. And it's certainly not lost on us that with energy separate from wind, solar is certainly something that's been in the news recently about solar panels and ag land. And then, something we are very cognizant of is that solar panels, food, and housing all like the same type of land. They want flat land with easy roads and infrastructure, and they're all competing now for those same land uses.
And we're already seeing those conflicts and opposition coming forth from communities opposing this project, right? We really got to consider, these different aspects, when we're going to reach our sustainability goals. We got to think about food security, agriculture. We got to think about Native Hawaiian rights, right? And yeah, it's just these renewable energy projects, at least the utility scale ones will take up a lot of land, which is, very limited, especially on Oahu. So how do we work together to really put the interests of the community and other interests, together instead of being, placed in the back burner or ignored?
Yeah, and maybe, because we're getting towards the end of our time, if I could offer just a wrapping up thought and then turn it over to you. I think that question of how do we work together is more than just how do we work together as all of us on one island. And, our energy question has certainly been, how does each island get to 100% renewable energy? And we've also been kind of treating the food question that way as well. How does each island become self-sufficient? But to me, I think we're an archipelago and we have to hukilike on these questions. And how do we work together? What are the strengths of Hawaii, Maui, Oahu, Kauai, Molokai, Lanai, to work together and support each other as well, for as a state, for all of us to be able to get to our goals? And I think that's a question we haven't really been as thoughtful on in terms of energy, food, housing, and all the different goals together.
Yeah, I think that the biggest message that I did want to, address was, we really need to ensure that the communities are active participants and meaningfully engaged in this development of clean energy projects. And it needs to be community-led, community-driven, culturally-driven. And we really need to bring communities to the table as partners. And we really need to listen to their experiences, their perspective, rather than viewing them as obstacles to this crucial transition for Hawaii. We really need to rebuild the system from the people up, and combating climate change in ways that, that work in harmony with other long-term goals, like we mentioned. And, as you mentioned earlier, Scott, Hawaii is in the spotlight today, and it is leading the world in its clean energy policy. And I think that it's very crucial at this point in time that Hawaii now lead by implementing these policies in a right and pono way. We're not against renewable energy. What we are asking for is that projects are done right, with equity, with community in mind, and with environmental justice. And I think that's what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you. And I would just add to that with aloha, that, I think there's a lot of folks here who feel like part of Hawaii's gift to the world is aloha, and showing that we can live on small islands and listen to each other, work together. And because of that island thinking and knowing that we do live in a limited resource area, that we have to be wise stewards of our resources, and the better we can do, the canoe has to fit everyone in there. And so maybe with that, we'll wrap it up. And Sunny, just thank you again for being here today and sharing your mana'o with us.
And thank you, Scott, for having me here. I appreciate it. Mahalo.
Yeah. Mahalo. Aloha.